Over Yu-Gi-Oh's almost 25-year history, there have been an enormous amount of cards released, both in the anime, the online game, and the official trading card game. Back when Yu-Gi-Oh started, it wasn't that common for there to be archetypes. In fact, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the fact that Toon Monsters were actually a series. As at the time, most duels that were played were done with one iconic monster or a few of them. The three Blue Eyes White Dragons, the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, the Red Eyes Black Dragon, and of course the Dark Magician being the most notable ones. As Yu-Gi-Oh evolved, we saw the rise of archetypes. Whereas when Yu-Gi-Oh started, and I cannot say this 100% to be a fact, it is simply something that I choose to believe as my personal headcanon and a sort of theory that makes sense for me. When Yu-Gi-Oh started, it was mostly focused on attributes and the types of monsters instead of creating these archetypes. But as the game went on and subsequently evolved, archetypes became more and more common. By the end of the first Yu-Gi-Oh series, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, this still wasn't that big of a thing. Mostly you saw a few cards that were connected. A few that come to mind are Yugi's Gadget Monsters, as well as the Magnet Warrior Monsters. At the time when you look at certain decks that were made, for example, Merrick's deck, who of course used the Winged Dragon of Ra card, there are almost no cards in his deck that specific. With all that out of the way, I will be taking a look at the Entity Archetype first of all. There are only 6 cards in this particular archetype. I actually do own all 6 of them as of recent. But I won't be showing these. I will be editing it a bit so that there will be pictures of the cards that I reference. So to start, you have the outer entity Azathoth, outer entity Nyarla, elder entity Netis, and elder entity Norden. And finally, you have old entity Hastor and old entity Kufugua. If those names sound extremely weird to you, I'm going to take a shot in the dark here and say you've probably never read anything by H.P. Lovecraft or particular works that fall under the Cthulhu mythos. I obviously reference these things because these cards are inspired by the Cthulhu mythos. Each of the monsters is actually based on a god mentioned in one of these stories. And their names also reference this. I do believe that the Japanese names are actually also outer gods, but I'm not entirely sure on that, so don't quote me on that. Azathoth is, well, just Azathoth, really. There's an H at the end in the original works, but they removed that. So now he's a Twitchfoth, I guess. Nyarla is probably the one that is most edited because it is this just impossible name. And I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. This is, I believe, just this. Norden as well. Hester is spelled differently, and Kufugua is also spelled differently from what we see on the cards. But they do pretty much just have the names that they have in the stories. You can also just look up Entity series on various search engines, of course, and you will find these cards and what they are based on. And if you're not familiar with Lovecraft mythos and the Cthulhu mythos, I will be explaining a little bit about that. Because one thing that Lovecraft and the Cthulhu mythos, which is sort of the expanded work of his canon, often reference is that these elder gods, these outer gods or old gods, they don't care much for humanity, and I do believe that this is something that is reflected in these cards, and it's something that I find vastly interesting because I actually really love literature. So to see that referenced in Yu-Gi-Oh cards and how they play, and not just like in the artwork, which we'll get to in a moment, that to me is pretty cool to see. And what I mean by this is that the 6 cards mentioned in this series are all extra deck monsters. They are 2 Xyz monsters, the outer entities, 2 fusion monsters, the elder entities, and finally the old entities are synchro monsters. And you might question like why I think that is referencing why these gods don't particularly take an interest in humanity. If we look at the Yu-Gi-Oh playing field, I believe that the main deck could be seen as sort of our world, the main world where most things take place. And the extra deck is sort of this alternate dimension. Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5 in particular really goes in on that idea of separate dimensions, but that is a whole other story. But it sort of, to me at least, references this idea of that these gods aren't particularly interested in our world, but they do have influence over it. The requirements to summon any of the entity monsters isn't particularly tough to meet, as it usually just contains of having 2 monsters that meet the requirements. But to sort of summon their full potential is a bit harder. The outer entity Azathoth in particular is one of the most powerful cards. I believe it was also limited for a time. It might still be limited. Again, that's not really what I want to discuss with this video. I'm very sorry if I say a lot. But the outer entity Azathoth is one of the most powerful beings that is described in the Lovecraft mythos, where he is often described by many different names, the Daemon Sultan as well as the Nuclear Chaos. And that last part in particular is very important when you look at his effect, as when it is summoned using a fusion, a synchro, and an Xyz monster as material, it can sort of nuke the field. By removing one of these materials, you can just destroy everything on the field. And I do believe that references the Nuclear Chaos part of the monster. And that's also like, again, to use that full potential, you need the collected power. You don't really need it, but it is suggested that you do use the collected power of all these gods, at least 1 synchro, 1 fusion, and 1 Xyz, which again is the exact type of monsters that these monsters are. And that actually brings me to the artwork. The artwork is probably the most controversial part of this, and I say controversial very lightly because there wasn't actually a controversy around this, but this is something that I did look into a little bit. I saw this post on Reddit asking people about what they thought of these cards, and the person who posted it wasn't particularly known with the Lovecraft mythos, but they did mention that they were curious to see what other people thought. And one of the comments that I saw said, "These cards look generic." And if you know Lovecraft, generic is far from the works that he puts out. Many of the works are just mind-boggling and almost incomprehensible, especially in like the visual department. So I do think that the artist who made these cards did meet a certain challenge in this. And I don't think generic is really the right word for me personally. Again, I'm referencing like one comment that I saw on this, so it isn't like this is the commonly accepted thought behind it, but it's just something that I saw and that did get me thinking, and I feel like that's also really why I felt like doing this particular video. The monsters look far from generic for me, especially because when you look at like the artwork for other Yu-Gi-Oh cards, these are some of the weirdest and creepiest looking monsters you'll ever see in the game. Azathoth, not so much in particular, as it is quite a dark card. It's a little hard to see what's going on. But especially Nyarla, that is just like one giant ugly worm thing filled with mouths and hands, and it's honestly something you would see in your nightmares. They are, I guess, child-friendly in a way that you wouldn't literally see them in your nightmares, but they are very much creepy and disturbing to look at. which does meet up with the Lovecraft mythos, but I don't believe that these are very accurate adaptations of Lovecraft's story. And I think that that's why a lot of people who've read Lovecraft and have seen these cards aren't particularly fond of the artwork on them, because they're not very good translations of his work. And that's actually something that I feel kind of bummed out about, because it's, to me, not meant to be a translation of his works. I see it more as an inspiration. So it doesn't have to meet what Lovecraft described these beings as looking like. And that's kind of why I do like them a lot. Again, it seems to me like it was more of a jumping off point than saying we made these Lovecraft beings into actual Yu-Gi-Oh cards. In that vein, there's also a lot of other archetypes, one that I will be talking about in the future, but I'm going to quickly mention here. The invoked archetype references to very specific things from Dante's Divine Comedy, those being Purgatory and the River Cocytus. If you look at how they look, they're absolutely not translations of the actual literature to an artwork, or more accurately, a illustration. And I think that that's sort of the same thing that they went for here. So to me, these monsters do look very interesting, but if someone asks, are they good adaptations of Lovecraft's work? The answer would be no. But again, it's hard to make Lovecraft's work visual. I am going to quickly put like a little asterisk here, or a side note as I like to call it. If you're looking for a very good adaptation of Lovecraft's work into a visual medium, there's a manga called At the Mountains of Madness based on Lovecraft's story, also by the same name, which in my opinion does do it very well. But that is also a very literal translation, as I like to call it, from the literature to the visual medium. And these cards are absolutely not that. Despite this, these cards are absolutely some of my favorites. I think that they can work well in just about any deck. I love how they look, and I love what they were inspired by. So to me, it's almost like I'm fanboying here a bit, because seeing some of the comments that I saw from people that they didn't really like these cards because they were poor translations, it didn't necessarily make me feel bad, but it did make me feel like they deserve a bit more appreciation. Again, if I'm being honest and objective, they're not good translations, but they are very interesting inspirations. And to see something almost as incomprehensible as Lovecraft's literature translated into Yu-Gi-Oh artworks, as well as how they play and what cards they were, I think there was a bit more focus on just making these cards work based on the Lovecraft mythos, with the particular monsters that they chose, how they are summoned and how they function, rather than how they look. But that to me is absolutely one of the reasons why I do love these cards, and it's always really interesting to see, to me at least, books being translated into any visual media. An adaptation of a book into a film is always just really cool to see, or it can be really disappointing. And in that sense, I'm always reminded of the fact that the movie Blade Runner, it's something that looks fantastic. Its story is fantastic. It's a really cool movie, but when you look at the book that it's based on, it's just not that at all. And in that sense, I think that sort of logic applies here. Like, it's based on a certain thing, but it isn't that thing anymore. It is something of its own. And that's really what these cards are to me.